Well, first thing I did was just a quick general retouch, got rid of some straps I didn't like, did a quick liquefy just because I thought his sleeve looked a little too baggy, and pulled his glove down a bit, just nothing too crazy yet, and then got into pen tooling him out. For all of my composites, I do cut them out with the pen tool. It takes a bit of extra time, but I feel it is so worth it to have a nice clean edge and know that I'm not going to later find some weird wand tool mistake somewhere way down the line and have to figure out how to fix that. So I do like to slave over the pen tool for a while. And then sort of deciding on my cropping. Realized this one little part was cropped out in the original picture, so I was just fixing that little nubbin. And the background plopped in there, that's from the Raw Exchange store. And the light on his face I knew needed a light source for it to make any sense, so I decided to light up this handy window that was right about in the right place to be casting that light on his face. I like to edit in black and white sometimes, just for a period of my edit, because then you can ignore the color and just really get your lighting and contrast down more how you like it. I don't always do this, but sometimes for something like this that's so affected by the color, because he was so warm and the background was red and kind of teal, there was a lot going on, so I kept switching into black and white to get it where I wanted it to be contrast wise. Here I'm using some layer styles on a new layer to add this edge glow on him. I used a inner shadow and then just changed it to overlay to add that little edge light on him. Because if you do an inner glow, it's equally around from all sides. So if you do the inner shadow, you can get it coming from just one angle, like it's that light coming in the window on his edge. And here I'm just doing some digital painting, shading, and it's basically just dodging and burning at this point, not getting into any color work, but just finding little details I want to accentuate. And I'm on an overlay layer, just painting in little things here and there. I decided that I didn't want his costume to be brassy and warm like this. It was originally a very steampunk look. I mean, it still is, but I wanted to take it a bit more sci-fi space looking, so I figured if his armor was silver, that would head a bit more futuristic than the brass typical look of a steampunk armor. And more shading. Throughout this process, will be doing a lot of adding a new layer and painting in more details. And then I'm doing another inner shadow, this time using red, emulating that red light from the ceiling, like it's casting a little edge light on him there. And messed with his armor a bit more color-wise. I did a sort of teal photo filter to make it match the background a little better. And then started throwing in some flares. Those are also from the Raw Exchange store. I didn't end up loving them, and by the end of the edit basically took them all the way out, but there's a little hint of them up in the corner there. And next I started adding in little lights on his armor, adding to the sci-fi futuristic look. Figured if things are glowing, that's a bit fancy and cool, and it's just something I like to do. I love working with glows and lights and sparkles and all that fun stuff. So I threw an outer glow on there, and then I also used a drop shadow but set it to screen, gave kind of a blue tint, which I later decided I didn't like the color. But at this point I'm just sort of playing around, seeing where I like the lights, what I want to be lit up. I ended up doing all these lines and deciding it looked too much and a little too faked. And so I'll go back in a minute and get rid of most of those glowing lines. But I did like the little glowing circles here and there on different parts of the armor and his helmet. There we go, getting rid of some of the stuff I didn't like. And he had this little cannon thing on his shoulder, sort of jobby, not sure what you want to call that. So I thought it would be cool to have this weird honeycomb techie looking texture inside there and glow it up a bit. And working on shading a bit more. It was a little too bright on his arm. And I really wanted this foam armor to look a bit more metallic, so throughout the edit I'll continually add more highlights, and having having that contrast in like darks and highlights on the mask especially really starts to make it look like it's actually shiny metal. And here's where I was messing around with the color of all those lights I added and decided I didn't like the blue. It was a little too distracting, and so I went for just sort of a pale yellow I eventually landed on. Felt like it kind of matched the brassiness that I left on the goggles, so I wanted to tie that in so it wasn't the only warm thing in the image. And painting in some more details, adding that red edge light on things that weren't on the very, very edge of the masked file. Because when I did the inner shadow on that layer style, it's not going to do all the details of extra little areas that light would be falling, so I was painting those in. And then started adding some smoke, giving a bit more atmosphere and texture to the image. These smoke textures are also from the Raw Exchange store. Putting some in front and behind just to really envelop him in this environment, make it look like he's actually there. And then the ones behind him I felt really helped to separate him from the background a little bit because they lightened it up behind him. And I realized these very bright windows would be casting a bit more light on some areas, so I was on an overlay layer just painting in a few little spots that I thought would help sell that fact. And some particles. You'll never guess where they're from. They are from the Raw Exchange store. And I usually do one set to screen and then I duplicate it and set it to soft light and turn it down and kind of mess with the opacity of both of those until I find a middle ground that I like. A lot of times when you just do the screen layer, I feel like it lightens the overall image a little too much. And messing with an overlay layer on top of everything, sort of darkening down the edges and adding a bit more to that red. And then I added in some flares from the Raw Exchange store again. I tried two of them and ended up going with the stripy, warmer one. So I found the angle I liked. I just kept duplicating it, resizing it, and moving it to one of the other little light sources. And that's just set to screen, and then I masked away some of the darker areas. Yeah, the screen blending mode just gets rid of the dark and only shows you the lighter pixels, so it's an easy way to plop something like a lens flare on there. And then pen tooled the arm real quick because I wanted to darken it down as a whole and just get a nice selection on it. So I just did a brightness contrast adjustment layer, darken that down a little bit. Felt like it was drawing your attention a bit more than his face. I wanted his face to be probably one of the brightest parts on him, so you look right there. And altered the color a little bit, kind of played up that sort of cyan teal look to it. And did the shadow highlight, bringing up his shadows a little more, darkening down his highlights. And more painting, just really getting into the details on the face, making his eyes pop a little more. I recently discovered that you can rotate your image while you're working on it, and that was very exciting. It's a lot of times with my pen tablet you can't quite color in a certain direction, and it's easier if you can just spin it around and go the way your hand wants to go. So again, just more digital painting, little bits of highlights here and there where I think light would be falling on the armor, and trying to make it a little bit more shiny and metallic looking. Desaturated part of his ear, just thought it was overall a little too red right there. And then the mask was made to sort of look like a steampunk Iron Man, so I decided I didn't want it to look too much like Iron Man, or really at all. So in a minute I get rid of the mouth by duplicating it a bunch of times, and it blends in, and I think it had kind of a cool texture once it was all done. And I brightened up the goggles, just selected the glass part and did a brightness contrast to lighten those up a little bit. Doing some detail painting on the goggles. And a lot of my digital painting is just looking at the light and thinking, how would that light fall on this, and how can I accentuate details to make this pop a little more and make it make a little more sense. And added a bit more light behind him just to brighten up and separate him a little more. Here's what I mentioned before, where I'm trying to make it look less like Iron Man with that very noticeable mouth shape that is very obviously a, well, not obvious to everyone, but it looks like Iron Man. So added other little lines, just duplicating the same piece and moving it up a little bit. And then decided the rest of the mask looked a little too smooth now that there were lines there, so I added a few extra little areas of detailed line bits here and there. Using the warp tool to reshape it, kind of make it look more like it's going with the angle of the mask. And then I'm just masking it away from the gears because I obviously want it to be underneath. And more digital painting. I also notice, and this is the tiny details I like to fix that probably no one will notice, but I realized that all those little corners had the same little imperfection and it looked very duplicated. So I was going through and stamping them a little bit, altering each one slightly different than the next, so it didn't look like the same exact line copied a bunch of times. And for the rest of the edit, just looking at little details, zooming way in there and fixing little imperfections and just any last thing that pops out to me as something that bothers me, and then it was pretty much done. So here is the finished piece. I think the only major change is I added that light on his shoulder that the honeycomb textury area was casting, and that's how this image came to be.